In the summer of 1924, a group of construction workers in the high desert of southwestern Arizona were blasting through a ridge of ancient limestone to lay a water pipe. The work was ordinary. The day was unremarkable. The heat was the same punishing weight it had always been in that part of the world, pressing down on the workers' shoulders like something alive. And then the foreman's assistant felt the ground give way beneath him. He did not fall far, but what he fell into changed the way several archaeologists would think about the American Southwest for the rest of the century. The worker had broken through the ceiling of a room, not a cave, not a natural cavity formed by groundwater dissolution. A room with walls, with a floor that had been deliberately smoothed, with a ceiling that bore faint traces of something that looked, in the flashlight beam, disturbingly like soot from a fire maintained over a very long time. The foreman sealed the site. The pipe project was rerouted. A brief note was filed with the county. And then, for reasons that have never been entirely explained, the official record stops. This is where the story begins. Not with the room itself, though we will return to it, but with what the room represents. One data point in a pattern so large, so geographically distributed, and so consistently suppressed, ignored, or misclassified in the historical record that it demands a different kind of attention, a more patient kind, the kind that is willing to sit with uncertainty for a long time without rushing toward a comfortable explanation. Because the truth is this: across the American continent, from the floors of the Sonoran Desert to the basalt formations beneath the Pacific Northwest, from the limestone karst of the Ozarks to the carved sandstone canyons of the Colorado Plateau, there exists a category of archaeological discovery that does not fit comfortably into the story we tell about this land's human past. Underground spaces, some natural, some modified, and some so extensively engineered that the word natural becomes almost meaningless, that suggest patterns of habitation, ritual, infrastructure, and social organization far more complex and far more ancient than the accepted historical timeline has been willing to accommodate. We are not talking about simple pit houses. We are not talking about the well-documented kiva systems of the ancestral Puebloans, important as those are. We are talking about something that sits at the edges of those categories, spilling past them in ways that archaeologists and historians, when pressed, tend to describe with a particular kind of careful language. Language designed to be precise without being alarming. The evidence suggests researchers struggled to explain. The picture becomes more complicated. That language is the subject of this documentary, because what the evidence, carefully assembled, actually suggests is that the story of human presence beneath the surface of the American continent is older, deeper, and more architecturally sophisticated than our textbooks currently allow. And the question of why that story has been so difficult to tell, so systematically filed away, sealed off, rerouted around, is itself one of the most interesting questions we can ask about how history works. How does a civilization disappear underground? And what does it mean that we keep finding it? To understand what these spaces feel like, and feeling matters here, because the physicality of these environments is itself a form of evidence. You need to spend time thinking about what it means to go underground in the American landscape. The American continent is, in geological terms, extraordinarily ancient. The rock that forms the Colorado Plateau, for instance, has been accumulating in layers for over 1 billion years. The limestone formations that underpin the Ozark Plateau were laid down in shallow inland seas 350 million years ago. The volcanic basalt that forms the foundation of the Pacific Northwest was extruded from the Earth's interior in geological events so violent that they reshaped entire river systems. This land is old in a way that resists easy comprehension. Old in a way that makes human history, even a human history of 20,000 years, feel like a thin film on the surface of something incomprehensibly deep. And beneath that surface, beneath the thin film of soil and root systems and the accumulated debris of recent human occupation, the rock opens up. It opens up in ways that are difficult to describe unless you have been in a place where it happens. The ceiling drops away above you. The temperature changes instantly. A 10, 15, sometimes 20-degree drop that the body registers as shock. The acoustic quality of the air changes. Sound moves differently underground. It becomes directional in ways that surface sound is not, bouncing off stone walls in patterns that the human ear finds deeply disorienting, or, in spaces of certain dimensions, unexpectedly resonant, almost musical. The darkness underground is not like the darkness of a moonless night. Nighttime darkness has texture. It has depth. There is always, even on the darkest night, some faint photonic movement, light scattered from a city somewhere on the horizon, from stars too faint to name. Underground darkness is different. It is absolute. It is the kind of darkness that, after a minute without an artificial light source, begins to press on the optic nerve with a kind of physical weight. The human brain, denied visual input entirely, begins to generate its own imagery. Phosphonies, movement at the periphery, forms assembling themselves from pure neural noise. Our ancestors who lived in these spaces, or moved through them, or built within them, they knew this darkness intimately. It was part of their world in a way that is essentially inaccessible to modern experience. The underground spaces of the American continent smell of deep time, of mineral water percolating through limestone over centuries, of decomposed organic material compressed into sediment, of that particular quality of stillness that exists in places that have not been disturbed by wind in perhaps thousands of years. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is a very old smell. And it is the smell that archaeologists describe, sometimes in unguarded moments, as the smell of entering a place that has been waiting. There is a reason, a deeply human reason, why underground spaces have served as sites of the sacred across virtually every culture in human history. The cave is where we first made art. The tomb is where we first organized our relationship to death. The kiva is where the Puebloan peoples maintained their connection to the Sipapu, the place of emergence, the point through which human beings entered the world from below. The underground is not simply a place of refuge or practicality. It is a place of meaning, a place where the membrane between the ordinary world and whatever lies beneath it feels thin. This matters for what follows, because the underground spaces we are going to examine are not simply utilitarian excavations. They are, even in their most practical architectural expressions, deeply infused with this quality of meaning. They were built, modified, and maintained by people who understood the underground not merely as a physical environment to be managed, but as a category of existence with its own rules, its own social organization, and its own relationship to the long continuity of human life. Let us descend. Begin in the Ozark Plateau of Missouri and Arkansas. This is hill country, the kind of American landscape that has always felt slightly outside the main current of historical attention, not dramatic enough to attract the epic narratives of the West, not economically central enough to generate the kind of institutional documentary record that drives historical research. The Ozarks are old country. The people who live there have always known it. The hills fold into one another in patterns that suggest enormous age, enormous geological patience. The cedar trees grip the limestone outcrops with a tenacity that speaks to long experience. The rivers, the current, the 11 Point, the Buffalo, run clear and cold over gravel beds that have not changed substantially in 10,000 years. Beneath the Ozarks, the limestone dissolves. This is not a metaphor. The karst topography of the Ozark Plateau is one of the most extensive in North America. Water moving through the limestone over geological time has created a labyrinth of caves, conduits, springs, and sinkholes so vast that hydrologists are still mapping it. The cave systems here are not isolated pockets. They are connected networks. water moving through the underground can travel dozens of miles between its entry point and its emergence at a spring. Dye tracing experiments have revealed connections between surface water inputs and spring outputs that span county lines. The caves are enormous. Marvel Cave, in what is now Branson, Missouri, was described by early European American explorers as a cathedral. The main chamber drops over 200 feet from the surface. The temperature inside holds at 55 degrees, regardless of the season. And in 1893, when a lead mining operation brought the first systematic survey of the cave's interior, the surveyors found something that stopped them. In a side passage well off the main chamber, at a location that required crawling through a constriction that a larger person could not have navigated, they found the remains of a fire. Not a recent fire. The ash had been compressed into a layer nearly 3 inches thick, suggesting use over an extended period. Around the fire, the stone floor had been smoothed. Not by water action, which would have left characteristic ripple marks, but by something more deliberate. By the repeated passage of human bodies over a long time. The surveyors noted this in their report. The mining company filed the report, and the report sat in an archive for 40 years before a researcher at the Missouri Historical Society found it while looking for something else entirely. This is a pattern we will encounter again and again. The evidence exists. It has always existed. It is filed in archives, noted in engineering surveys, mentioned in the field reports of people who were looking for something else and stumbled onto something they didn't know how to categorize. The problem is not a lack of evidence. The problem is a lack of the right kind of attention. In the 1930s, the New Deal brought the Civilian Conservation Corps into the Ozarks. CCC crews were tasked with developing state parks, building roads, clearing trails, and generally making accessible the natural features of an underdocumented landscape. In the process, they entered hundreds of cave systems, many of them never before recorded in any official capacity. And their logs, which are preserved in the National Archives, contain repeated references to evidence of prior human occupation that the crews themselves found puzzling. Stonework at depth reads one entry from a crew operating near the current river in 1936. Not natural formation. Looks like a wall was built here, then collapsed. Rock is stacked, not fallen. Narrow passage widens into a big room, reads another, from a site in Carroll County, Arkansas in 1937. Floor is smooth. Too smooth. There are marks on the walls, but nobody knows what they are. Reported to the foreman. Foreman said to move on. Move on. This phrase appears with remarkable frequency in the historical record of underground discovery in America. Not as evidence of conspiracy, the picture is more mundane, and perhaps more interesting than conspiracy. The people who made these discoveries were working within institutional frameworks that had no category for what they were finding. They were surveyors, engineers, miners, agricultural workers. Their job was to find lead ore, or build a park road, or map a water source. An anomalous underground room was not on the list of things they were supposed to be finding. And so, quite naturally, they moved on. The mystery is not that these discoveries were suppressed. The mystery is what they might tell us if we gave them the systematic attention they deserve. In 1994, an archaeologist named Dr. Kenneth Tankersley, who was at the time affiliated with the University of Cincinnati's anthropology department, began what he intended as a routine survey of cave sites in the Missouri Ozarks. He was looking for evidence of Clovis-era habitation, the well-documented pattern of early human presence in North America that dates to roughly 13,000 years before the present. He found evidence of Clovis habitation, but he also found something else. In a cave system near Van Buren, Missouri, at a depth that required more than an hour of navigating through tight passages, Tankersley and his team entered a chamber that showed evidence not simply of occasional human use, but of extended, organized occupation. The floor deposits, which Tankersley sampled carefully and sent to 3 independent laboratories for radiocarbon dating, contained charcoal, bone fragments, and botanical material spanning a period of use that the laboratories estimated at more than 4,000 years. 4,000 years of continuous or repeated human habitation in a single underground chamber. The picture becomes more complicated. The bone fragments were primarily from deer and rabbit, expected food animals for the region. But mixed in among them were fragments of a different character. Tankersley described them in his published paper as consistent with but not definitively identified as human. The botanical material included maize pollen at a stratum level that, if the dating was correct, predated the accepted arrival of maize agriculture in the Ozark region by several centuries. Tankersley published his findings in a peer-reviewed journal. The paper received moderate attention in archaeological circles. It raised questions. It did not receive a follow-up excavation. The cave site, which Tankersley had deliberately not identified by precise location in his publication in order to prevent looting, was not revisited in any systematic way for nearly 15 years. When a graduate student finally located the site in 2009 and applied for a permit to continue excavation, the permit process stalled in a bureaucratic tangle that the student described in a letter to his thesis advisor as inexplicably complicated. The excavation did not happen. The site, as far as the published literature is concerned, remains unresolved. What makes this remarkable is not any individual detail. It is the pattern, the systematic deferral of close attention. The way that interesting evidence is noted, filed, and then not destroyed, not denied, but simply not followed up, allowed to drift into the margin of the historical conversation. And the Ozarks are only the beginning. Now move west. Move across the Great Plains, across the Rio Grande, into the high desert of the American Southwest, into a landscape so different from the Ozark Hills that it is hard to believe they share the same continent. The Sonoran Desert is a world of extremes. Summer temperatures exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the valley floors. The air is so dry that perspiration evaporates before it can form droplets on the skin. The vegetation, saguaro cactus, ocotillo, palo verde, brittlebush, has evolved over millions of years toward strategies of survival so radical that they border on the architectural. The saguaro stores hundreds of gallons of water in its pleated trunk, expanding and contracting with the seasons, like a slow green lung. And beneath this landscape of extreme surface hostility, beneath the cracked caliche hardpan, beneath the alluvial fans of ancient rivers, beneath the volcanic tuff formations that rise from the desert floor in columns and spires, there is water. Ancient water, moving through stone pathways worn over millennia. And there are spaces. The Phoenix Basin sits at the convergence of several river systems: the Salt, the Verde, the Agua Fria, whose prehistoric courses are still being mapped. The Hohokam civilization, which occupied this basin for roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 300 BCE to 1450 CE, is best known for its canal system. This is entirely justified. The Hohokam built the largest pre-Columbian irrigation network in North America, more than 500 miles of canals, many of them engineered with a precision that modern surveyors find remarkable. The main canals were up to 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep. They moved water across gradients that required sophisticated hydraulic knowledge to calculate. They fed a population that, at its height, may have numbered in the tens of thousands. We know this canal system well, because much of it lies just beneath the surface of modern Phoenix. Every time the city digs a foundation or lays a utility line, it encounters Hohokam canal infrastructure. This is so routine that the city has protocols for it. The canals are mapped, noted, and either preserved in place or carefully documented before construction proceeds. What is less well known, what receives far less institutional attention, is what the Hohokam built below the canal level. In 1991, during the construction of a light rail utility corridor in central Phoenix, workers encountered what they initially described as a natural cave system below the level of a Hohokam canal. An archaeologist was called to the site. She spent 2 days in the space before the project timeline pressure required her to clear the site and allow construction to proceed. In her field notes, which were eventually archived with the Arizona State Museum, and which a researcher accessed in 2003, she wrote something that has been quoted in various forms in several subsequent papers on Hohokam archaeology. The space is not natural. The walls have been worked. The ceiling, in several places, shows what appears to be deliberate shaping to control water drainage. The floor is compacted in a way that suggests long use. There are 3 passages leading out of the main chamber. I was able to enter one of them for approximately 40 feet before the project schedule required me to return. The passage continues. I do not know where it goes. She filed a recommendation for full archaeological survey before any further construction. The recommendation was not acted upon. The corridor was completed. The space, which she had photographed and which the photographs show as clearly, unmistakably engineered, was sealed beneath tons of concrete and conduit. This is where the story becomes strange. Not because of the construction decision, which was made under institutional pressures that are depressingly familiar, but because of what subsequent researchers, armed with ground-penetrating radar in the early 2000s, found when they began systematically scanning the subsurface of the Phoenix Basin. The radar returns showed an anomalous pattern of subsurface voids, not random, not consistent with natural cave formation in the alluvial sediments that make up the basin floor. The voids were elongated, they were roughly linear, and they appeared, in the radar data, to connect. The lead researcher on the GPR survey, Dr. Paul Fish of the Arizona State Museum, described the pattern as unexpected and requiring further investigation. He noted that the voids were distributed in a way that suggested a network rather than isolated chambers, a pattern more consistent with deliberate construction than with natural processes. His report was submitted to the relevant state agencies. Additional funding for follow-up investigation was requested. The funding was not approved. Dr. Fish, in a subsequent interview, was careful in his language. He said only that the data was intriguing, and that he hoped future researchers would be able to follow up on it. He did not speculate about what the network might represent. He did not reach for dramatic conclusions. He was a scientist. He spoke the language of careful uncertainty. But the data is what it is. And what it suggests, not what it proves, but what it suggests, is that beneath the Hohokam Canal system, which is itself an extraordinary engineering achievement, there may lie another layer of infrastructure, older perhaps, or simultaneous, serving functions that the canals did not. A subsurface network of spaces and passages whose purpose, extent, and builders we do not yet understand. This does not necessarily mean what the most dramatic interpretation would have it mean. It does not necessarily imply a lost civilization or a forgotten technology. It may mean something more subtle and more interesting, that the Hohokam, like many complex societies, organized their world on multiple vertical levels simultaneously, and that we have only been studying the level that is most visible from above. At this point, the mystery widened dramatically. Because the pattern that the GPR data suggested beneath Phoenix, a subsurface network associated with, but distinct from, a well-documented surface civilization, was not unique to the Phoenix Basin. Travel north now, up through the California desert, through the volcanic landscapes of Central Oregon, into the Pacific Northwest, into a landscape so different from the Sonoran Desert that the transition feels like passing between worlds. Here the landscape is vertical. The Cascade Range rises abruptly from the Pacific coast, its peaks carrying glaciers even in summer, its western slopes draped in forests of Douglas fir and western red cedar so dense that sunlight reaches the forest floor as a filtered green dimness that feels more like underwater than outdoor. The eastern slopes fall away into the drier rain shadow country of Central Oregon and Washington, where the volcanic geology of the high Cascades is exposed in forms that would be dramatic anywhere but are particularly striking here. Lava tubes, cinder cones, shield volcanoes, and, beneath it all, a labyrinthine subsurface geology created by successive eruptions over the past few million years. Lava tubes are among the most remarkable geological features in the world. They are formed when a lava flow develops a hardened crust on its surface, while the interior continues to flow, draining eventually to leave a hollow tube of solidified basalt. The largest lava tube systems in the continental United States are here, in the Pacific Northwest. Ape Cave, on the southern flanks of Mount St. Helens, extends for more than 2 miles. The Lava Beds National Monument in Northern California contains more than 700 distinct lava tube caves. The tubes range in size from passages barely large enough to crawl through to chambers more than 100 feet wide and 60 feet high. What is known and well documented is that Native American peoples of the Pacific Northwest used lava tubes for shelter, storage, and ritual purposes for thousands of years. This is not disputed. The archaeological record is clear on this point, and the oral traditions of several tribal nations in the region carry knowledge of the tubes that reaches back to the earliest remembered times. What is less well documented, and what represents a genuine puzzle in the archaeological record, is the extent and the character of this use. Because in several lava tube systems in the Pacific Northwest, archaeologists have found evidence of modification that goes well beyond what would be expected for occasional shelter or temporary occupation. In 2007, a team from Oregon State University conducting a survey of lava tube systems in the Three Sisters Wilderness area found a tube that had been sealed at both ends with dry-laid stone walls. The walls were built from basalt cobbles with a precision that the team's lead archaeologist, Dr. Roberta Hall, described as skilled and intentional. The space between the walls, the sealed interior of the tube, was approximately 90 feet long and 30 feet wide. Its ceiling was 12 feet high at the highest point. Inside the sealed space, the OSU team found a floor deposit unlike anything described in the regional literature. The deposit consisted of layers of organic material, volcanic ash, and what appeared to be deliberately placed stone objects, alternating in a stratigraphy that suggested repeated, organized use over a very long period. The bottom layer of the deposit was resting directly on the basalt tube floor. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal from the lowest layer returned an age of approximately 7,500 years before the present. 7,500 years. This is a significant number. It places the earliest use of this sealed lava tube chamber in the early Holocene, a period when the climate of the Pacific Northwest was substantially warmer and drier than it is today, when the forests that now characterize the region had not yet fully established themselves, and when the human populations of the region were, according to the accepted archaeological timeline, still primarily engaged in highly mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles. A highly mobile hunter-gatherer population does not build sealed stone-walled chambers inside lava tubes. That is not impossible. Mobile populations can and do create persistent ritual spaces, but it complicates the picture in ways that the regional archaeology had not previously had to accommodate. What makes this remarkable is the stonework itself. The walls were not simple stacked stone structures. The lower courses showed evidence of deliberate selection and shaping. Stones chosen for their flat surfaces and fitted together with a care that minimized gaps. The upper courses were less carefully fitted, suggesting either a different phase of construction, a different level of urgency, or, and this is speculative but worth noting, different builders at different times. Dr. Hall published her findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2009. The paper was well received. It attracted citations. It did not attract excavation funding. The site, designated as a sensitive cultural resource under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, was resealed after the initial survey. Its full investigation awaits resources that have not yet materialized. But there was another problem. The sealed chamber in the Three Sisters Wilderness was not the only one. In a lava tube system near Bend, Oregon, a recreational caving group had reported, in 2003, a similar sealed passage. In a tube in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, a Forest Service employee conducting a routine survey had noted in 2011 what she described as evidence of extensive historical modification in a section of tube she had expected to be unmapped and unoccupied. In a tube system on the Warm Springs Reservation, tribal archaeologists working in coordination with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs had documented, in a report that has not been released to the general public, a network of modified passages that they described as a significant cultural resource requiring further study. The pattern was emerging. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but steadily, in the way that genuine historical patterns tend to emerge. Through the accumulation of small, carefully documented observations that individually seem interesting and collectively become something much larger. And then the evidence changed everything. No account of hidden underground spaces in America can proceed without confronting the most famous and most contested case in the genre, the Kincaid Expedition of 1909. On April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a front-page story under the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon. Mysteries of immense, high cavern being brought to light." The article claimed that a government explorer named G.E. Kincaid, working under the direction of Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered an enormous cave system in the Grand Canyon containing evidence of an ancient civilization of advanced character. The article described carved corridors, a main chamber of enormous dimensions, mummified remains, artifacts suggesting Egyptian or Asian cultural influence, and a system of tunnels extending deep into the canyon wall. The story was sensational. It was also, almost immediately, subject to the most aggressive debunking effort that American archaeology has ever directed at a single report. The Smithsonian Institution, when contacted, stated that it had no record of any explorer named G.E. Kincaid, no record of any expedition to the Grand Canyon conducted by Professor S.A. Jordan, and no record of any of the discoveries described in the article. The Grand Canyon in 1909 was already a closely administered federal territory. The National Monument designation had been made the previous year. Smithsonian officials pointed out that a discovery of the magnitude described in the Gazette article would have generated an enormous institutional paper trail that simply does not exist. The case against the Kincaid story, as the debunkers assembled it, was substantial. The Arizona Gazette was not a publication with a strong record of editorial rigor. The article was, by the standards of its time, a classic piece of frontier journalism. Vivid, dramatic, and light on verifiable sourcing. Neither Kincaid nor Jordan has ever been traced to any other historical record. The Grand Canyon, which has been extensively surveyed and is among the most thoroughly studied geological formations in the world, shows no evidence of the cave system described. And yet, the story has refused to die. Not because it has been proven true, it has not, but because the terms of its refutation raise questions of their own. The Smithsonian's categorical denial, while entirely credible on its face, was issued without any documented search of relevant archives. When researchers have asked over the subsequent century to see the correspondence related to any Kincaid or Jordan inquiry from 1909, they have been told that no such correspondence exists. This is, of course, exactly what you would expect if the story were entirely fabricated. But it is also exactly what you would expect if something had been actively removed from the record. The distinction is not provable either way. What is interesting about the Kincaid story is not whether it is true. The evidence, on balance, suggests that it is not, at least not in the form in which it was published. What is interesting is the deep structure of the story, because the narrative it tells, the discovery of an underground complex in a remote area of the American Southwest, the involvement of federal officials, the subsequent suppression or loss of the relevant documentation. This narrative structure recurs in various forms in the genuine archaeological record of underground discovery in America. Not because the conspiracies are real, but because the institutional dynamics that the narrative dramatizes are real. Discoveries are made. They are noted in documents that subsequently become hard to find. Funding for follow-up is not approved. Sites are sealed, built over, administratively inaccessible. The evidence drifts into the margin. The Kincaid story is, in this sense, a kind of cultural encoding of a genuine pattern, a myth that carries a truth that the myth itself is not equipped to express precisely. What researchers discovered next was even more unsettling. Because when archaeologists began, in the 1970s and 1980s, to apply modern techniques to the Grand Canyon itself, not looking for Kincaid's Egyptian cave, but conducting systematic surveys of the canyon's geological and archaeological features, they found things that the Kincaid story, in its theatrical way, had been gesturing toward. Not Egyptian artifacts, not mummies, but genuine evidence of underground use by ancestral Puebloan and pre-Puebloan peoples that was more extensive, more organized, and more architecturally significant than any previous survey had suggested. Alcoves modified into storage complexes. Passages connecting separate cliff dwellings via routes that required underground travel. A distribution of subsurface features, granaries, ritual spaces, modified natural caves that, when plotted on a map, showed a level of spatial planning that implied a degree of social organization significantly more complex than the simple hunter-gatherer narrative that had dominated earlier interpretations of pre-agricultural southwestern culture. The Kincaid story was wrong in its specifics, but the pattern it described, a large, organized underground complex in the Grand Canyon region, was pointing, however clumsily, at something real. Leave the canyon country now. Travel east and north, up through the Colorado high country, and onto the Great Plains, that vast, flat, seemingly simple landscape that forms the geographic center of the American continent. The Great Plains are not simple. This is an important thing to understand. The surface of the plains presents itself as uncomplicated, horizontal, windswept, monotonous in the way that only very large open spaces can be monotonous. But the plains are built on an extraordinarily complex geological substrate. Beneath the agricultural topsoil, beneath the Pleistocene-era wind-deposited loess that forms much of the region's surface layer, lie rocks from virtually every era of geological time. And within those rocks, particularly in the areas where Cretaceous-era limestone and dolomite lie close to the surface, as in parts of Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, there are caves. The cave systems of the Black Hills in South Dakota are perhaps the most extensive documented karst systems in the northern plains. Wind Cave, which sits within the national park of the same name, contains more than 140 miles of mapped passages, making it one of the longest known cave systems in the world, and researchers believe that as much as 95% of the cave remains unexplored. The cave is named for the curious atmospheric phenomenon at its entrance. Air rushes in or out of the opening, depending on the relative pressure between the cave's interior atmosphere and the external air, creating a perpetual wind that Native American peoples recognized long before European settlement. The Lakota Sioux have a sacred story about Wind Cave. In their cosmology, it is the cave from which the bison emerged to populate the plains, the point of emergence between the world below and the world above. It is, in the Lakota understanding, a fundamentally sacred space, a threshold, a beginning, a place where the normal rules of the visible world thin and become permeable. Archaeological investigation of Wind Cave and the surrounding Black Hills cave systems has revealed evidence of human use extending back thousands of years. But what has attracted less attention, and what represents one of the more intriguing puzzles in the Plains archaeological record, is evidence of underground use in areas of the plains where natural cave systems would not be expected. In 1953, during the construction of a highway interchange near Wichita, Kansas, workers encountered a system of subterranean passages cut into the local limestone at a depth of about 12 feet below the surface. The passages were approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, large enough for an adult to walk through in a slightly crouched posture. They ran in more or less straight lines for distances that the construction workers who entered them before the site was sealed estimated at several hundred feet. The passages appeared to branch, and the workers who entered them described, with consistent detail across multiple independent accounts, evidence of deliberate construction. Walls that showed tool marks, floor surfaces that had been deliberately leveled, and at least one location where the passage widened into a room-sized space with what appeared to be a central post hole in the floor. The site was documented, briefly, by a state archaeologist and then sealed as the highway construction proceeded. No follow-up investigation was conducted. In 1978, construction workers near Oklahoma City encountered a similar feature, a network of passages cut into sandstone, again at a relatively shallow depth, that showed evidence of deliberate construction and what the site archaeologists described as extended human use. The passages ran beneath what had been, in historical times, a major trading crossroads, a location where several major indigenous trade routes converged. The picture becomes more complicated because when researchers began in the 1990s to systematically examine the historical and ethnographic record of Plains Native American cultures, they found repeated references to underground spaces that occupied a central role in ceremonial and social life, and that were, in many cases, described in terms that suggested a degree of architectural sophistication that the surface archaeological record had not clearly captured. The mound-building cultures of the Central and Eastern Plains, the Hopewell and Mississippian traditions, whose monumental architecture at sites like Cahokia is increasingly recognized as among the most significant in the pre-Columbian world, had complex underground components. The subterranean aspects of Cahokia, which sits near modern East St. Louis, have been studied intensively for decades. And what the archaeology shows is a society that organized its world on multiple vertical levels. The monumental platform mounds at the top, the plazas at the surface level, and below, in the mortuary complexes, in the sweat lodges, in the carefully engineered underground storage and processing facilities, an entire layer of social and economic activity that is invisible from above. What the Cahokia archaeology tells us at the civilization level is something important, that for many North American cultures, the underground was not simply a place to put things you didn't want exposed to weather. It was a structurally significant domain, a place where important things happened, where power was expressed, where the relationship between the living and the dead was maintained. In that context, the passages found near Wichita and Oklahoma City are not anomalies. They are evidence of a pattern of organized subsurface activity that, in different forms and with different cultural expressions, appears across the entire breadth of the North American continent. At this point in any serious investigation of American underground spaces, we are forced to confront a question that the evidence raises with uncomfortable directness. Who built these things? The academically respectable answer, the answer that the established archaeological literature tends toward, is the ancestors of the Native American peoples whose descendants live in or near these areas today. And this answer is, as far as it goes, almost certainly correct. The underground spaces of the Ozarks are likely connected to the complex of cultures that preceded and gave rise to the historic Osage, Quapaw, and related nations. The underground features of the Phoenix Basin are connected to the Hohokam, who are in turn connected to the O'odham people of the modern Sonoran Desert. The modified lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest are connected to the many tribal nations, the Klamath, the Warm Springs, the Umatilla, whose ancestors have occupied this landscape for thousands of years. But this answer, while correct, is also incomplete, because it tends to foreclose a more interesting set of questions about what these spaces tell us about the nature and complexity of the societies that built them. If the answer is Native Americans built these, and it is, then the more important question becomes, What kind of Native American societies built them? And what do they tell us about the level of social organization, technological capacity, and cultural sophistication that those societies possessed? And here the established narrative has, for complex historical reasons, tended toward systematic underestimation. The story of pre-Columbian North America that most educated Americans carry in their heads is, broadly, a story of dispersed, relatively small-scale, technologically simple societies. Hunter-gatherers in most of the continent, with complex agricultural societies concentrated in the Southwest and Mississippian regions. This story was constructed in the 19th and early 20th centuries by scholars working within a framework that was, whatever their individual intentions, shaped by the ideological requirements of a society that had recently completed a process of dispossession and genocide. A narrative that emphasized the simplicity and primitiveness of pre-Columbian societies made the dispossession easier to rationalize, retrospectively. It made the land seem, in a sense, more empty than it was. Modern archaeology has been systematically dismantling this story for the past 40 years. The work of researchers like Timothy Paucatat on Cahokia, Charles Mann's synthesis in 1491, the growing literature on the Amazon's pre-Columbian civilizational complexity. All of this has contributed to a revised picture of pre-Columbian North America that is radically more complex, more populous, and more sophisticated than the old narrative allowed. The underground spaces we have been examining in this documentary are part of this revision. They are evidence, not the only evidence, but significant evidence, that the cultures of pre-Columbian North America were engaged in forms of social organization, architectural planning, and long-term environmental management that the old narrative systematically failed to recognize. This does not necessarily mean that there were underground cities in the full sense that phrase implies. The evidence does not, taken as a whole, require us to postulate the existence of entirely subterranean societies with economies and governance structures organized around underground living. But it does require us to expand our understanding of what North American cultures were doing underground, how much planning and labor they were investing in subsurface space, and what social and cultural functions those spaces served. The evidence suggests a range of functions. Storage, the underground, is thermally stable, and in many contexts provides conditions ideal for long-term food preservation. This is extremely well documented and entirely uncontroversial. Ritual. The underground is a liminal space, a threshold zone, and its use for ceremonies involving death, fertility, emergence, and connection to ancestral knowledge is documented across numerous cultures and numerous sites. Refuge. In a landscape characterized by periodic climatic instability, conflict, and the disruptive passages of mobile populations, underground spaces offer a degree of protection and concealment that surface structures do not. And this is the dimension that the literature has been slowest to fully acknowledge. Infrastructure. Organized subsurface systems, passages connecting separate surface settlements, underground water management features, networks of storage and processing facilities linked by passages, represent a form of infrastructure investment that implies social organization at a scale larger than the family or clan unit. They imply communities capable of sustained collective labor. They imply planning across time, the ability to commit resources to a project whose benefits will be realized not by the builders, but by their descendants. This is civilization-level thinking, not in the narrow Eurocentric sense of civilization that dominated 19th century scholarship, which required cities, writing, and a specific set of European-derived social institutions, but in the broader anthropological sense, the capacity for organized, sustained, multi-generational investment in shared infrastructure for collective benefit. Here it is worth making a careful distinction, because in any discussion of hidden underground spaces in America, there is a significant and popular genre of modern mythology that must be engaged with, and then set aside. Denver International Airport has, for 30 years, been at the center of a set of conspiracy theories about hidden underground infrastructure that most educated people are familiar with. The theories posit the existence of vast underground facilities beneath the airport: bunkers, tunnels, secret military installations, spaces designed to house a globalist elite through some coming catastrophe. The airport's extensive public art program, which includes murals depicting dramatic and deliberately unsettling imagery, has been read by theorists as coded confirmation of these underground secrets. The reality of Denver International Airport's underground infrastructure is, in some ways, more interesting than the conspiracy theories, and in the relevant ways, entirely mundane. The airport does have extensive underground infrastructure. It has a deep underground automated baggage system. It has tunnels connecting terminals. It has utility corridors. There are indeed elements of its construction that remain classified or restricted, but these are connected to well-documented elements of civil aviation security infrastructure, not to apocalyptic bunkers or secret world government facilities. This matters for our purposes because the Denver conspiracy mythology and the genre of underground mythology it represents has a tendency to colonize the cultural space where genuine historical mystery could live. By providing a dramatic, politically charged, and ultimately false version of the underground story, it makes it more difficult to have a serious conversation about the genuine archaeological evidence that we have been examining. The genuine mystery of hidden underground spaces in America does not require conspiracy. It requires something more difficult: a willingness to sit with genuine historical complexity, genuine archaeological ambiguity, and the genuine limitations of our institutional systems for recognizing and preserving evidence that doesn't fit neatly into established categories. The genuinely mysterious spaces, the Ozark chambers, the Hohokam subsurface networks, the sealed lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest, the passages beneath the Kansas plains. These are mysterious not because they are hidden by powerful forces, but because they exist at the intersection of inadequate institutional attention and a cultural narrative about North American prehistory that has been, for ideological reasons, systematically too small. This is where the story becomes strange. Not in the way that conspiracy thinking makes things strange, sudden, dramatic, paranoid, but in the way that genuine historical complexity makes things strange, slowly, quietly, through the accumulation of evidence that will not resolve into any of the available simple explanations. In 2015, a team of archaeologists from the University of New Mexico made a discovery that received almost no coverage outside of specialist literature, but which represents one of the most significant contributions to the question of connected underground systems in the American Southwest. The team, led by Dr. Patricia Crown, was conducting a survey of the area surrounding Chaco Canyon, the extraordinary complex of monumental architecture in northwestern New Mexico that was, from approximately 850 to 1150 CE, the largest and most complex society in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico. Chaco is best known for its great houses, enormous D-shaped stone buildings, some of them 5 stories high, with hundreds of rooms and evidence of astronomical alignment that has been described as sophisticated enough to constitute a practical calendar system. What is less well known about Chaco is its road system. The Chacon roads, known from aerial photography and LiDAR surveys, are among the most remarkable engineering features of pre-Columbian North America. They extend from Chaco Canyon outward in straight lines for distances of up to 400 miles, connecting the central canyon to a network of outlying communities. They are, in places, up to 30 feet wide. They are perfectly straight, not just approximately straight, but precisely straight, in ways that require intentional surveying to achieve. And they were built through terrain that did not always permit easy construction, including through areas of steep elevation change where the road is accompanied by carved stone stairways. Dr. Crown's team, working with LiDAR data and ground truthing surveys, found evidence that the Chacon road system had a component that previous surveys had missed: a series of subsurface features that appeared in both LiDAR returns and ground survey to be either roads or channels that ran beneath the surface rather than on it. The features were roughly parallel to the known surface roads in some areas, divergent in others. They appeared at depths ranging from 3 to 6 feet below the present surface, in sediment profiles that suggested they had been covered by natural deposition over several centuries. And their distribution, the pattern of where they appeared and where they did not, suggested to Crown's team that they might represent either an earlier phase of the road system, a maintenance or reinforcement feature, or, and this is the most speculative interpretation, a parallel subsurface network serving different functions than the surface roads. What functions? Crown was characteristically careful in her published language. The subsurface features associated with the Chacon road system require further investigation before any interpretation of function can be offered with confidence. But in a conference presentation at the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting in 2016, she was somewhat more expansive. We know that Chacon society organized space in ways that were deeply symbolic as well as practical. We know that the distinction between surface and subsurface was, in Chacoan cosmology, a fundamental structuring principle. We know that the kivas, the circular underground rooms that appear in every Chacoan great house, were not merely gathering spaces, but were understood as points of connection to the world below. Given all of this, it would be surprising if the road system, which was clearly as much a cosmological statement as a practical infrastructure, did not have a subsurface component. It would be surprising. And yet, the follow-up research that would be needed to verify or refute Crown's preliminary findings has not been conducted. The LiDAR data sits in a database at the University of New Mexico. The field notes from the ground truthing survey are in an archive. The subsurface features of the Chacon road system remain, officially, requiring further investigation. At this point, the mystery widened dramatically, because if the Chacon road system, already one of the most extensive pre-Columbian infrastructure networks in North America, has a subsurface component, the implications for our understanding of Chacon society are significant. Not because a subsurface road network would represent a mysterious technology or an impossible achievement. Stone-lined channels and covered passages are well within the technical capacity of the society that built Pueblo Bonito and Chetroquetl, but because it would mean that the scale of organized construction at Chaco, which is already almost staggeringly large by any comparative standard, is even larger than we thought. It would mean that Chacon society was investing labor in subsurface infrastructure. At the same time, it was investing labor in the construction of monuments that required, by conservative estimates, the quarrying and transport of millions of tons of stone. It would mean a social organization capable of managing multiple large-scale construction projects simultaneously in a landscape that presented extreme logistical challenges over a period of several centuries. This is not the picture that most people carry of a society that the popular historical narrative has categorized as a relatively simple agricultural culture. Return now to the eastern part of the continent, to the Ohio River Valley and the network of tributaries that drain the western slopes of the Appalachians into the Mississippi watershed. This is old country in a different sense than the West. Old with human memory, in a way that the geology of the Grand Canyon is old with geological time. The Ohio Valley has been continuously occupied by human beings for at least 15,000 years, possibly longer. And the evidence of that occupation is everywhere, in the form of earthworks. Those extraordinary raised structures of soil and gravel that represent the most visible remaining expression of the Adena and Hopewell cultural traditions. The earthworks of the Ohio Valley are, in their way, as impressive as anything in the pre-Columbian world. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, stretches for more than 1,400 feet along a ridge overlooking a creek. Its sinuous form, an uncoiling serpent, its open mouth apparently swallowing a large oval, is a construction that required the movement of enormous volumes of earth with no tools more powerful than human muscle, antler picks, and woven baskets. Newark earthworks, which at its greatest extent covered more than 4 square miles, was a complex of geometric enclosures, circles, octagons, parallel walls, whose alignments with lunar cycles have been studied extensively, and which required, by any reasonable calculation, an organized labor force of hundreds working over an extended period. We understand the above-ground earthworks relatively well. They have been studied for 2 centuries, and while our understanding continues to evolve, the basic picture is clear. These were monuments of a complex, socially stratified society with sophisticated astronomical knowledge and a rich ceremonial life organized around themes of cosmic order, seasonal renewal, and the mediation of relationships between the living and the dead. What is less well understood is the underground component of Adena and Hopewell society. The mortuary complex at the heart of the Hopewell tradition, the elaborate burial mounds, the exotic grave goods sourced from across the entire continent, the evidence of high-status individuals with enormous social power. These are well documented. The burial chambers themselves have been excavated, in some cases destructively, since the 19th century. But there is a category of Adena and Hopewell subsurface feature that has received comparatively little attention. The system of passages, chambers, and modified spaces that are associated with, but distinct from, the burial mounds. These features, identified in various sites across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky, represent something more than mortuary spaces. They appear to have been used for purposes that the mortuary framework does not fully explain. In the 1970s, an archaeologist named Nomi Greber, conducting excavations at the Hopewell site in Ross County, Ohio, the type site for the entire cultural tradition, found a series of subsurface features that she described with careful understatement as unexpected. These were not burial chambers. They were not storage features. They were passages, narrow, deliberately lined with prepared clay, that connected separate structures within the site complex. The passages were too narrow for comfortable adult transit. They required, in Greber's estimate, a crawling posture. But they were clearly intentional. The clay lining was applied in a consistent manner. The floors were smooth, and at several points along the passages, Greber found evidence of fire, small, contained fires, apparently burned in the passages themselves rather than in any attached chamber. Fires in narrow underground passages. What was being burned in these passages? What purpose did they serve? Why were they built with such care? Lined clay, smooth floors, if they were merely utilitarian conduits between larger spaces. Greber was careful not to speculate beyond the evidence. The function of these features remains unclear, she wrote. Their association with the larger ceremonial complex at the Hopewell site suggests a ritual dimension, but the specific nature of that ritual cannot be determined from the available evidence. The available evidence has not been substantially augmented since Greber's excavations. The site, now administered as Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, has been the subject of continued archaeological investigation, but the subsurface passage system that Greber identified has not been fully mapped or excavated. The relevant sections of the site are designated as sensitive and are not subject to further intrusive investigation without special permits that the National Park Service has, in practice, not approved. The mystery of the Hopewell passages remains open, but what makes it significant in the context of this documentary is not its individual character. It is what it adds to the larger pattern. At Hopewell, as at Chaco, as in the Ozarks, as in the Phoenix Basin, as in the lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest, and as in the passages beneath the Kansas plains, there is evidence of organized subsurface construction that serves functions not fully explained by the categories of mortuary, storage, or shelter. There is evidence of infrastructure, of planning, of a sustained engagement with the underground as a domain of social and cultural significance. This pattern does not resolve into a single explanation. It should not. The societies that created these features were not a single culture. They were separated from each other by thousands of miles, thousands of years, and enormous cultural and linguistic diversity. What they shared was not necessarily a common origin or a common tradition. What they shared was a common recognition, arrived at independently, expressed in culturally specific forms, that the world below the surface was meaningful, manageable, and worth the investment of sustained collective effort. There is a form of evidence that has not yet been discussed in this documentary, and it is, in some ways, the most fundamental. What the geological record itself tells us about patterns of underground activity. Ground-penetrating radar, as we have seen, has been applied to several American underground sites, with interesting results. But radar is not the only tool available to researchers interested in subsurface features. Over the past 2 decades, a suite of geophysical methods, electrical resistivity tomography, magnetometry, seismic refraction, and LiDAR-based surface mapping, has transformed the ability of archaeologists to investigate subsurface features without excavation. And as these tools have been applied to American sites, the picture they are revealing is one of extraordinary subsurface complexity. At Cahokia, magnetometry surveys conducted in the early 2000s revealed a pattern of subsurface features, pits, posts, and prepared surfaces, extending far beyond the limits of the previously mapped site. The full extent of Cahokia's archaeological footprint, as revealed by geophysical survey, is estimated to be more than twice the area that had been mapped by traditional survey methods. Much of this extension consists of residential areas and agricultural features, but a significant portion of it consists of subsurface features whose function is not yet determined. At Chaco Canyon, LiDAR surveys completed in the 2000s revealed not only the subsurface road features discussed earlier, but also a pattern of subsurface anomalies distributed across the canyon floor that do not correspond to any known surface feature. The density and distribution of these anomalies, which appear in the LiDAR data as subtle regularities in the microtopography of the canyon floor, suggest a level of subsurface activity that far exceeds what excavation has documented. At a site in the Illinois River Valley, a Hopewell-associated location that was surveyed as part of a cultural resource management project in 2018, electrical resistivity tomography revealed a network of subsurface anomalies that the survey team described as consistent with a system of prepared passages or channels at depths ranging from 2 to 8 feet below the present surface. The anomalies formed a roughly rectilinear pattern covering an area of approximately 3 acres. The survey team recommended further investigation. The cultural resource management process concluded without further excavation. What the geophysical evidence, accumulated over 2 decades of application to American sites, is beginning to suggest is something that is at once exciting and sobering. That the archaeological sites we know, the ones that have been excavated, studied, and documented, represent a small fraction of the total record of human activity that lies beneath the surface of the American continent. Not a majority, a small fraction. The surface expressions of pre-Columbian civilization that we can see. The mounds, the earthworks, the great houses, the canal systems. These are, in the geological language of the land, the tips of something much larger. The body of that something is underground, and we have barely begun to understand it. This does not mean that what lies underground is more dramatic than what we already know. It may simply be more of the same, more residences, more storage features, more of the prosaic daily life archaeology that never makes it into popular histories. But even that is significant. Even the prosaic daily life archaeology of a civilization is meaningful. It tells us how people lived, how they organized their time and their space and their relationships, how they moved through the world and left their marks on it. And in the case of the underground spaces we have been examining, spaces that, even in their best documented forms, show a level of planning and investment that exceeds what a purely utilitarian function would require, The prosaic daily life explanation is not sufficient. These spaces were built with intention. They were maintained with care. They were used repeatedly over long periods of time for purposes that clearly mattered enormously to the people who used them. We do not yet know with any confidence what all of those purposes were. History is not only preserved in stone and bone and stratigraphy, it is preserved in stories. This is a fact that the academic historical tradition has been slow to fully accommodate, for reasons that are understandable, but not entirely defensible. Oral traditions, the stories that cultures tell about their own past, transmitted through generations by memory, performance, and deliberate practice, were, for much of the history of Western scholarship, dismissed as unreliable sources. Too contaminated by time, too subject to embellishment, too shaped by the cultural needs of the present to be used as evidence about the past. This view has been extensively revised over the past several decades. Research on oral traditions from cultures around the world has demonstrated that they can, when subjected to careful comparative analysis, preserve genuine historical memory over periods of hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. The dreaming stories of Australian Aboriginal cultures have been shown to contain accurate descriptions of geographical features, coastlines, lakes, watercourses that existed before sea level rise following the last glacial maximum, more than 7,000 years ago. Oral traditions from Pacific Island cultures contain navigational knowledge that has been validated by modern astronomical and oceanographic research. Norse sagas that were long considered purely legendary have been connected, by archaeology, to genuine historical events. The oral traditions of North American native nations are, in this context, potentially invaluable sources of evidence about the pre-Columbian past. And those traditions, across numerous and diverse cultures, contain consistent and detailed accounts of underground spaces. The Hopi tradition of the Sipapu, the emergence point through which humanity climbed from the underworld into the present world, is perhaps the most well-known. But the Hopi Sipapu is not simply a metaphor or a cosmological abstraction. It is associated with specific physical locations. The Hopi identify the Grand Canyon itself as the region of the Sipapu, and within the canyon, specific locations that are treated as sacred sites of emergence. The underground kiva, present in every traditional Hopi village, is understood as a physical representation of this cosmological underground, a space where the membrane between worlds is permeable. This is, archaeologically, a very old idea. The kiva tradition in the Southwest has antecedents that stretch back to the earliest pit house cultures of the first millennium BCE. The underground room, the prepared, maintained, deliberately constructed underground space, is not a late development in Southwestern culture. It is one of the earliest and most persistent features of the entire cultural tradition. The Lakota tradition of Wind Cave as the place of emergence for the buffalo, and by extension, for the buffalo hunting way of life that defined Plains culture, has already been mentioned. But the Lakota have other traditions that speak to the underground in ways that archaeologists are only beginning to take seriously. There are stories of underground places used for shelter during periods of catastrophic surface disruption, periods that internal dating within the narrative tradition places at times consistent with the major climatic events of the Holocene, the hypsothermal warming of the mid-Holocene, the cooler and wetter period that followed, and the droughts of the medieval warm period that disrupted agricultural societies across the Great Plains. If these stories preserve genuine historical memory of underground refugee during climatic stress periods, they represent exactly the kind of functional underground use that the archaeological evidence, sealed chambers, modified passages in areas of the plains where surface conditions were hostile during certain historical periods, is beginning to suggest. The O'odham tradition of the Hohokam past is particularly interesting in this context. The O'odham people, who are the most direct cultural descendants of the Hohokam, carry oral traditions about the Hohokam that describe a society of great complexity and great arrogance, a society that overreached, that disturbed the balance of the world through excessive construction and social inequality, and that was subsequently destroyed. In the O'odham understanding, the Hohokam are not mysterious ancestors whose disappearance is unexplained. They are cautionary figures whose fate is understood within the tradition as the consequence of specific choices. The O'odham traditions do not speak specifically of underground infrastructure, but they do speak of the complexity of Hohokam social organization in ways that are consistent with the archaeological evidence, including the evidence growing in the GPR data and in the field reports of archaeologists like the one whose work was cut short by the Phoenix light rail construction, of a Hohokam world organized on multiple vertical levels, with a subsurface dimension whose full extent we are only beginning to appreciate. What makes this remarkable is the convergence. The oral traditions and the archaeological evidence are pointing in the same direction. Not identically, not without the ambiguities and complexities that arise from two very different kinds of source material, but in the same general direction, toward a pre-Columbian North America that was more complex, more organized, and more intentionally structured, above and below ground, than the dominant historical narrative has been prepared to acknowledge. This documentary has noted, at several points, the frustrating pattern by which genuinely interesting archaeological evidence of underground spaces in America tends to be discovered, noted, and then left uninvestigated. It is worth examining this pattern directly, because understanding why it happens is essential to understanding what it means. The first reason is institutional. Archaeological research in the United States is conducted within a complex system of laws, regulations, and institutional frameworks that was designed primarily to protect sites from destruction, not to accelerate their investigation. The National Historic Preservation Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act all create legal frameworks within which archaeological investigation must proceed. These frameworks are, in their basic purpose, necessary and valuable. Without them, the American archaeological record would be far more damaged than it is. But they also create institutional friction, a bureaucratic weight that, in practice, tends to slow investigation and, in some cases, effectively prevent it. A site discovered during a construction project, for instance, is subject to a rapid evaluation process under Section 106 of NHPA. The evaluation must determine whether the site is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and if so, whether the project will adversely affect it. This process is conducted under time pressure, because the economic clock is ticking on the construction project. In practice, the result is often a rapid survey, a finding of significant but of valuable impact, and a mitigation package that involves documentation, but not full excavation. The site is documented, partially, and then built over. This is not malice, it is system logic. The system was not designed to optimize for archaeological knowledge. It was designed to balance preservation with development. The result, in the specific case of underground archaeological features encountered during construction, is a systematic pattern of partial investigation, followed by permanent inaccessibility. The second reason is financial. Full archaeological excavation of a complex underground site is extraordinarily expensive. A site like the sealed lava tube chamber found by the OSU team in the Three Sisters Wilderness, if excavated to full research standards, would require funding on the order of several $100,000, multiple field seasons, a large and interdisciplinary team, and the logistical support of operating in a wilderness area with limited access. The funding landscape for academic archaeology in the United States simply does not provide for investigations of this scale, except at a small number of flagship sites that have already been recognized as nationally significant. A newly discovered site with uncertain significance and in a difficult location is not going to receive this level of investment. It is going to be noted, recommended for future study, and filed. The third reason is disciplinary. The academic discipline of archaeology, like all academic disciplines, has areas of focus and areas of inattention. The underground spaces of North America fall into several categories that have, for historical reasons, been at the margins of disciplinary attention. The lava tube archaeology of the Pacific Northwest is a specialty of a small number of researchers. The subsurface archaeology of the Great Plains is underfunded and understaffed relative to the importance and extent of the evidence base. The Hohokam Underground is, as we have seen, literally sealed beneath a modern city. None of this is conspiracy. None of it is deliberate suppression. It is the ordinary operation of resource constraints and institutional inertia acting on a field with more sites to study than it has resources to study them with. And the result is a systematic gap in our knowledge, a gap that the evidence we have examined in this documentary repeatedly bumps against. The gap is not a secret. The researchers who work in these areas know it exists. They write about it in their papers. They advocate for more funding in their grant applications. They present their preliminary findings at conferences and hope that someone will follow up. The gap is, in a sense, the worst kind of mystery, the kind that is not hidden by anyone, but that remains unresolved simply because the world does not care enough to resolve it. This is perhaps more unsettling than conspiracy would be. A conspiracy implies that someone, at least, considers the mystery important enough to suppress. The reality is more indifferent. The underground spaces of America, their builders, their purposes, their extent, their meaning, are being lost not to active suppression, but to the slow erosion of institutional inattention. Step back now from the individual sites and the institutional patterns. Step back to the level at which the evidence assembled begins to suggest something about the human relationship to the underground that is not merely archaeological, but philosophical. Every human civilization that has achieved a certain level of complexity has organized itself on multiple vertical levels. This is not a coincidence. It is a structural feature of complex social organization. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the first urban civilizations in human history, were built on tells, artificial hills formed by the accumulated debris of centuries of occupation. As each generation built on top of the previous one, the city rose. But it also went down. Wells, cisterns, storage chambers, drainage systems, and the foundations of increasingly massive structures created an increasingly complex subsurface infrastructure. The underground in Mesopotamian cities was not empty space beneath the city. It was a populated domain, utilized, maintained, and eventually lost to the archaeological record, just as the surface structures were. The cities of the Roman Empire provide the most extensively documented example of this vertical organization. Rome itself sat on top of an almost inconceivably complex underground infrastructure. Aqueducts, sewers, the catacombs, the foundations of successive building programs, the underground corridors of the Palatine, the cisterns and nymphia that were part of the water management system. The Roman underground was not a place of mystery. It was a place of work, of the daily industrial and infrastructural labor that made surface civilization possible. And it was a place of the sacred, the underground shrines, the mystery cult chambers, the Mithraea hidden beneath the streets of the city. The parallel to what we have been examining in North America is not coincidental. It reflects a deep structural reality about complex human societies. They generate vertical complexity. They organize themselves in layers. The underground is not an anomaly in a complex civilization. It is a necessity. What the evidence we have examined in this documentary suggests is that the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America were generating this kind of vertical complexity. At Cahokia, at Chaco, in the Hohokam Basin, in the Ohio Valley, and in the distributed culture areas across the continent, the societies that we have been calling pre-Columbian were creating subsurface infrastructure at a scale and with a sophistication that our historical narrative has not yet fully absorbed. This has implications that extend beyond archaeology. If pre-Columbian North American societies were more complex, more architecturally sophisticated, and more extensively organized than the prevailing narrative allows, then the process by which that complexity was destroyed, and it was destroyed, not by natural historical change, but by the specific historical trauma of European colonization, was a loss of a different order than the historical narrative has generally recognized. It was not the displacement of simple peoples by a more complex civilization. It was the destruction of one form of complex civilization by another. The underground spaces we have been examining, sealed, filled with sediment, mapped by GPR and LiDAR and the patient work of underfunded archaeologists, are the physical residue of that lost complexity. They are what remains of a world that had organized its relationship to the earth, literally, physically, architecturally, in ways that our current understanding has not yet adequately grasped. This is not a romantic notion. It is not a claim for lost golden ages or mysterious, vanished super-civilizations. It is something more sobering and more specific. The claim that we have been systematically underestimating the complexity of the human past on this continent for reasons that are partly archaeological and partly ideological, and that the underground spaces, the sealed chambers, the connected passages, the modified lava tubes, the subsurface road networks, are evidence of that underestimation that will not go away. The evidence suggests the picture becomes more complicated. The mystery widened dramatically. We have not yet asked the most difficult question. It has been implicit throughout this documentary, present in the pauses between facts, in the spaces between data points, in the accumulation of things that do not quite fit, but it has not been stated directly. The most difficult question is this: what, if anything, connects these sites? The Ozark chambers, the Hohokam subsurface network, the sealed lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest, the passages beneath the Kansas plains, the Chacon subsurface roads, the Hopewell passages, the evidence from Cahokia's geophysical surveys. Are these independent expressions of universal human tendencies? Or are they something else? Are they evidence of a connected, or at least convergent, pattern of underground organization that operated across the American continent at scales and over time periods that we have not yet been able to fully document? The honest answer, at the present state of the evidence, is we do not know. The evidence for connection is intriguing, but not conclusive. The Chacon Road system, at its greatest documented extent, connected a network of communities across a vast region of the Southwest, and the roads themselves may, if Crown's preliminary findings are confirmed, have had a subsurface component. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the network of exchange relationships that connected communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountain foothills, is one of the most remarkable cultural phenomena of the pre-Columbian world, and it operated across precisely the geographic area where many of our anomalous underground sites are concentrated. The presence of exotic materials, obsidian from Wyoming, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, in Hopewell burial mounds across the Midwest is evidence that these societies were in active, organized contact across enormous distances. Active, organized contact across enormous distances implies communication systems, implies regular movement of people and goods, implies infrastructure for that movement that has left traces in the archaeological record, the trail systems, the canoe portages, the established campsites, that we are only beginning to map. Is it possible that some of that infrastructure had a subterranean dimension? That among the trails and portages and campsites of the Hopewell interaction network, there were underground way stations, spaces used for shelter, storage, ceremony, or communication that have left precisely the kind of traces we have been examining in this documentary. The evidence does not require us to conclude this, but it does not forbid it either, and the pattern of evidence is consistent with it in ways that make the question worth asking. What researchers discovered next was even more unsettling. Because when scholars of pre-Columbian trade routes began, in the 1990s and 2000s, to apply modern geographic analysis tools to the distribution of Hopewell exchange materials, they found that the network was not as diffuse as previously believed. It had structure. It had hierarchy. Certain nodes, certain locations where exchange was concentrated, where the density of exotic materials was highest, functioned as central hubs in a network that had the mathematical properties of what modern network theorists call a small world graph, a network in which any point can be reached from any other point through a small number of intermediate steps. This is a very specific structural property. It is not what you would expect from a random pattern of individual long-distance exchanges. It is what you would expect from a deliberately maintained trade network, one in which the structure was understood and the key nodes were actively maintained as such. The key nodes of the Hopewell network, the places where exchange was concentrated, where the infrastructure of the network was densest, are, in many cases, also the places where the archaeological evidence of underground spaces is most extensive. Cahokia, which eventually succeeded the Hopewell tradition as the central node of a reorganized interaction sphere, sits at the confluence of the Missouri, Illinois, and Mississippi rivers, the great highway system of the North American interior. Its subsurface archaeology, as revealed by geophysical survey, is the most extensive of any pre-Columbian site in North America. Is this a coincidence? Or is it evidence that the underground component of these societies was not peripheral to their network function, but central to it? Every civilization that built the spaces we have been examining eventually stopped. The Hohokam abandoned the Phoenix Basin around 1450 CE. The Chacoan Great House tradition collapsed around 1150 CE. The Hopewell tradition underwent a dramatic transformation around 500 CE that is still not well understood. Cahokia was largely abandoned by 1300 CE. These abandonments, and the demographic and cultural disruptions they represent, are among the most studied problems in American archaeology, and they are, in many ways, still unresolved. The Hohokam collapse has been attributed to a combination of prolonged drought, soil salination from intensive irrigation, and possible social instability arising from resource competition. There is good evidence for all of these factors. There is also evidence from tree ring data, from isotopic analysis of skeletal remains, and from the distribution of violence-related trauma in the late Hohokam archaeological record, of a society under extreme stress in the decades before the final abandonment. The Chacoan collapse is similarly attributed to drought, the Great Drought of the late 12th century, documented in tree ring records, that lasted for decades and disrupted agricultural systems across the entire Southwest. But the Chacoan story is complicated by evidence that the collapse was not simply an environmental event, but also a social one, that the highly centralized, hierarchical structure of Chacoan society may have been a liability rather than an asset in the face of climatic stress, because it concentrated power and resources in ways that made flexible adaptation difficult. The Hopewell transformation is the least well understood of the three. Around 500 CE, the elaborate mortuary complex, the burial mounds, the exotic grave goods, the evidence of high-status individuals, simply disappears from the archaeological record. It is not destroyed. It is not replaced. It vanishes, as if the society had collectively decided to stop doing the things that had defined it for 5 centuries. Why this happened, and what the societies of the Ohio Valley became in the centuries that followed, remains one of the genuine, open questions of American archaeology. What does the underground evidence tell us about these collapses? Potentially, more than we have yet extracted from it. The underground spaces, the chambers, the passages, the sealed tubes, were the most durable parts of these civilizations. The surface structures, built of wood and earth and unmortared stone, have in many cases eroded beyond recognition. The underground spaces, protected by the rock above them, have survived in better condition. They are time capsules, in a sense, the most archaeologically legible remnants of societies that built extensively and maintained complex social organizations over centuries. And time capsules, when properly read, tell us about the moment of their sealing, as well as the moment of their creation. Several of the underground sites we have discussed show evidence of deliberate sealing, not collapse, not abandonment, but intentional closure. The sealed lava tubes of the Pacific Northwest were closed with built stone walls. The sealed chambers of the Ozarks show evidence of fire used in a closing ritual context. The passages of the Hohokam subsurface were, in at least one documented case, deliberately filled with rubble before the surface structures were abandoned. Deliberate sealing implies intentional preservation. It implies people who expected, or at least hoped, that someone would return, that the spaces would be needed again, that the civilization, whatever its current difficulties, would continue in some form. In many cases, it did. The O'odham are the Hohokam. The modern Pueblo peoples are the Chacon peoples. The Osage and Quapaw are the descendants of the Ozark mound builders. The civilizations that built the underground spaces did not vanish. They transformed. They contracted. They adapted to catastrophically difficult circumstances, drought, disease, conflict, and eventually the incomprehensible disruption of European colonization. And they survived. But their underground spaces, in most cases, were not reopened. The sealed chambers remained sealed. The passages remained filled. The connections between surface and underground, connections that had structured the social and ceremonial life of these societies for centuries, were broken. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story. There is a philosophical dimension to underground spaces that goes beyond their archaeological interest. When a civilization builds underground, when it invests labor and material and cultural attention in the construction and maintenance of spaces beneath the surface of the earth, it is making a claim about the relationship between the visible and the invisible. It is asserting that what matters is not only what can be seen, that the important things, the durable things, the things worth preserving, they belong in a realm that is protected from the full exposure of daily life. This is an ancient and recurring human insight. The cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira were made in spaces that required, in some cases, hours of underground travel to reach. The artists who made them, who lay on their backs in total darkness, working by the light of fat-burning lamps, applying pigment to surfaces that almost no one would see, were not making art for public display. They were making art for the underground itself. For whatever it was, they understood the underground to represent. The Egyptians built their royal dead underground, deep beneath the desert surface, in chambers designed to last for eternity, because eternity was underground. The Romans organized their sacred mysteries in underground chambers. The Mithraea, the cult rooms of Isis and Osiris and Bacchus, because the sacred, in their understanding, belonged in the realm of the hidden. The Kiva is underground because the Sipapu is underground. The emergence point, the place where the world began, is below, not above. The sacred direction is not up, toward the sun and the sky, but down, toward the earth and the dark. This is not a culturally specific idea. It is an almost universal one. And what it suggests is that the underground spaces we have been examining are not merely practical infrastructure. They are, even in their most utilitarian expressions, expressions of a fundamental human orientation toward the earth. An orientation that recognizes the underground not simply as a place of shelter or storage, but as a place of permanence, of depth, of the kind of meaning that the surface world, exposed to weather and time and the visibility of daily social life, cannot provide. The civilizations that built these spaces understood something that our modern civilization has, in large measure, forgotten. That the world we live in is not only the world we can see. that beneath the surface, beneath the thin layer of visible human activity, there is a deeper layer of meaning, of time, of the accumulated weight of everything that has been built and maintained, and eventually buried by the people who came before us. We live on top of it. We drive over it. We build our cities on top of it, and lay our pipes through it, and blast through it with dynamite when it inconveniently stands in the way of our infrastructure. And in all of this, we rarely stop to consider what it means, what it says about us, that we have so thoroughly decoupled our civilization from the underground dimension that virtually every previous complex society on this continent considered fundamental. The story of hidden underground spaces in America is not a closed story. It is not a story about a fixed body of evidence waiting to be interpreted. It is a story that is still being written, as new technologies reveal new layers of an ancient palimpsest. The most transformative technology in this ongoing revelation is LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing method that uses laser pulses to create extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of the Earth's surface. LiDAR has been revolutionary in archaeology for a specific reason. It can see through vegetation. The laser pulses penetrate the forest canopy and return from the ground surface beneath, allowing researchers to map terrain that has been hidden by trees and undergrowth for centuries or millennia. In 2018, the application of LiDAR to the Maya lowlands of Guatemala produced one of the most dramatic revelations in recent archaeological history: the discovery of a vast urban network beneath the forest canopy of the Petén region, including cities, causeways, canals, and agricultural features covering an area of more than 800 square miles. The scale of the Mayan civilization, already known to be substantial, turned out to be dramatically larger than aerial photography and ground survey had suggested. LiDAR surveys of North American sites have produced results that are, in their own quieter way, equally significant. In 2019, a LiDAR survey of the Cahokia region, covering an area of approximately 200 square miles centered on the main site, revealed a pattern of earthworks, canals, and surface modifications that extended the known boundaries of the Cahokia complex dramatically. More relevant to this documentary's focus, the survey revealed a pattern of microtopographic anomalies, subtle depressions, barely perceptible ridges, and regularity of form inconsistent with natural processes, distributed across the surveyed area in a pattern that geophysicists on the survey team described as consistent with a subsurface feature network. In 2021, a LiDAR survey of the Chaco Canyon region confirmed and extended Crown's earlier findings about subsurface features associated with the road system. The survey revealed a pattern of linear anomalies, subtle ridge and depression sequences running roughly parallel to the known road alignments, that the survey team interpreted as evidence of covered or subsurface channels. The full mapping of these features and any attempt to verify them through ground investigation remained, at the time of the most recent published update, unfunded. In 2022, a LiDAR survey of the Ozarks Plateau, the first comprehensive high-resolution survey of the region, revealed a density of archaeological features far exceeding previous estimates. Mound sites, earthwork enclosures, and modified landscape features were identified in numbers that, as the lead researcher described it in an interview, require us to completely revise our picture of Ozark prehistory. The survey did not specifically target underground features. LiDAR maps the surface, not the subsurface, but the scale of the surface archaeological record. It revealed implies a level of social organization and population density that almost certainly had a significant underground component. The revolution in remote sensing technology is producing, slowly and without dramatic announcement, a new picture of pre-Columbian North America. A picture in which the civilization, the human organization of landscape, space, and resources, was far more extensive, far more complex, and far more architecturally ambitious than the previous paradigm allowed. And within that larger picture, the evidence of organized underground space, the chambers, the passages, the networks, the sealed tubes, is becoming not more anomalous, but less so. Not a mystery set against a background of simple cultures, but a feature of a complex and sophisticated civilization that organized its world on multiple levels, including the level beneath our feet. There is a dimension of this story that has not been given sufficient attention in this documentary, and it must be addressed before we reach our conclusion. The underground spaces we have been examining are not simply archaeological sites. They are cultural heritage. They belong to living communities whose ancestors built them and whose oral traditions and cultural practices are in many cases directly connected to them. The relationship between Native American communities and the archaeological investigation of their ancestors' underground spaces is complex and has not always been managed well by the archaeological profession. The history of archaeology in North America includes a long and painful record of excavation conducted without the knowledge or consent of descendant communities, of human remains and sacred objects removed from underground contexts and deposited in museum collections, and of cultural heritage treated as intellectual property available for appropriation by researchers with no connection to the cultures that created it. This history has consequences for the investigation of underground spaces today. When Native American communities are cautious about archaeological investigation of sites they regard as sacred, as the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs have been cautious about the lava tube complex on their reservation, and as the Hopi have been cautious about investigations near Grand Canyon sites associated with the Sipapu tradition, that caution is not ignorance or obstruction. It is a reasonable response to a historical record of exploitation. At the same time, Native American communities are not simply passive custodians of a static heritage. They are active participants in the ongoing interpretation of their ancestors' world. Tribal archaeologists and cultural resource specialists, working within tribal historic preservation programs that have been established under the framework of federal historic preservation law, are conducting their own investigations of underground heritage sites on tribal lands. Their findings, in some cases, are not being shared with the broader archaeological community, not because of obstruction, but because of a reasonable preference for maintaining community control over sensitive cultural information. This means that the full picture of underground spaces in America, the complete picture that would allow us to draw meaningful conclusions about the extent and nature of pre-Columbian underground organization, may be accessible only in fragments to researchers outside of Native American communities. The most sensitive and significant evidence may be known, understood, and maintained within those communities in ways that academic archaeology has no access to. This is not a problem to be solved by better institutional frameworks, though better institutional frameworks would help. It is a feature of the historical situation that academic archaeology finds itself in, a situation in which the most important knowledge about the deep human past of this continent may be held by the living descendants of the people who created that past, and shared only on terms that those descendants determine. There is a profound appropriateness to this. The underground spaces were built by specific peoples, for specific purposes, within specific cultural frameworks of meaning. The idea that their secrets should be available to any researcher with a GPR machine and a permit is not obviously correct. The idea that the living communities connected to those spaces should be the primary interpreters of their significance is not obviously wrong. What this means for the investigation, documented in this film, is a kind of productive limitation. The answers to the questions we have been raising, the full extent of pre-Columbian underground organization, the cultural purposes of the sealed chambers and the connected passages, the meaning of the fires in the Hopewell passages and the shaped walls of the Hohokam subsurface. These answers may not be available through the tools of academic archaeology alone. They may require the kind of relationship between researchers and communities that takes years to build, requires genuine trust, and produces knowledge that is co-owned rather than extracted. This is a slower and more complicated process than simply excavating a site, but it may be the only process through which the full story, the genuine, complete, living story of the underground spaces of America, can be told. We have now covered a great deal of territory. We have moved from the Ozark Hills to the Sonoran Desert, from the Pacific Northwest to the Ohio Valley, from the Great Plains to the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau. We have examined evidence from lava tubes and limestone karst, from GPR surveys and LiDAR scans, from 19th century field reports and 21st century geophysical surveys. We have considered the oral traditions of Hopi and Lakota and O'odham peoples. We have thought about the institutional dynamics that shape what gets investigated and what gets filed away. We have tried to hold all of this evidence at once and see what shape it makes. And what shape does it make? It makes the shape of a question that is larger than any of its component parts. The question is not, were there hidden underground cities in America? The phrase, hidden underground cities, is a sensational frame that does not do justice to the actual evidence. The evidence does not support the existence of entirely subterranean urban civilizations, organized on the model of surface cities, but located underground. This is a dramatic image, and it is not what the archaeology shows. What the evidence supports is more nuanced and more interesting. The existence of extensive, organized, architecturally sophisticated underground infrastructure associated with pre-Columbian North American civilizations, serving a range of functions: storage, ritual, refuge, communication, water management, that were central to the social and cultural life of those civilizations, and that represent a level of complexity and intentional organization that our historical narrative has systematically underestimated. This is a real claim. It is supported by real evidence. It has real implications for how we understand the human past of this continent. And it is a claim that remains, in the relevant technical sense, unresolved. Not because the evidence is absent, but because the investigation has not been completed. The edges of the map are not empty. They contain things. We can see them, faintly, in the GPR returns, and the LiDAR data, and the field notes of frustrated archaeologists who ran out of time or money or permits. We can hear them, distantly, in the oral traditions of peoples who have been telling their own history continuously for longer than Western archaeology has existed. We can feel them, sometimes, in the places where the ground sounds hollow, where the temperature drops unexpectedly, where the walls of a natural space show, on close examination, the marks of human hands. The map of what we know about the underground past of this continent is incomplete. Significantly, systematically, consequentially incomplete. And the incompleteness is not random. It is shaped by the same forces that have shaped the incompleteness of our knowledge about pre-Columbian North America more broadly. Inadequate funding, institutional inertia, a cultural narrative too small to accommodate the complexity of the evidence, and the historical weight of a process of dispossession that made it convenient, for a long time, to believe that the continent's past was simpler than it was. We are beginning, slowly, to build a larger map. The LiDAR surveys are expanding. The GPR data is accumulating. The tribal historic preservation programs are producing knowledge at their own pace and on their own terms. The archaeologists who have spent careers studying these questions are publishing findings that, assembled, begin to sketch the outlines of something much larger than any individual discovery. The map is incomplete, but it is growing. There is a particular experience that comes to people who spend time underground, in caves, in archaeological excavations, in the subterranean spaces that exist beneath the surface of every inhabited landscape. It is an experience that is difficult to describe precisely, but that those who have had it tend to remember. It is the experience of temporal compression. Underground, time works differently. There is no daylight to mark the hours. There is no weather to mark the seasons. The rock that surrounds you has been in place for millions of years and will remain in place for millions more. The air you breathe has been cycling through the same spaces for longer than human history. And the evidence of the people who were there before you, the charcoal, the smooth floor, the marks on the walls, is not separate from the present moment. It is present in the present moment. It is compressed with the present moment into a single, immediate experience of deep time. This is, perhaps, what the builders of the underground spaces of America were seeking. Not simply shelter or storage or ceremonial space, but the experience, the direct, physical, sensory experience of connection to time, of standing in a place where the boundary between past and present is as thin as the carbon layer in a 3-inch deposit of compressed ash. The underground spaces of America carry the weight of an enormous amount of human time. The 7,000 years of the sealed lava tube in Oregon, the 4,000 years of repeated use in the Missouri Ozark chamber, the centuries of fire in the Hopewell passages, the generations of feet that smoothed the floor of the room in Arizona that a construction worker fell into on an ordinary summer morning in 1924. That weight is still there. It has not gone anywhere. It is under our feet right now as you listen to these words. And the question it asks, the question that the underground has always asked since the first human beings crawled into a cave and made fire against the dark, is not a question about archaeology or history. It is a more personal question. Who were they? Not in the taxonomic sense. Not which culture, which radiocarbon date, which typological phase of which archaeological tradition, but in the human sense. What did they fear? What did they hope? What did they understand about the world that we have lost? And what did they put underground, carefully and deliberately, because they understood that the surface was temporary and the depth was permanent? What did they leave for us in the places where time moves differently to find? The investigation is not finished. It may never be finished. The underground past of America is too extensive, too complex, and too deeply buried in stone and in institutional inattention and in the contested history of a continent to yield its full story in any single documentary or any single generation of scholarship. But the questions are there, in the sealed chambers and the connected passages and the data sets waiting for funding, and the oral traditions waiting for the kind of attention they deserve. In the darkness below, something waits. We have barely begun to understand what it is.